Welcome to Chess Forge. If you are looking for a brutal attacking line that can end games in under 15 moves, then you have come to exactly the right place, because I have got the perfect line for you, the fried liver attack. The fried liver attack is a knight sacrifice on f7 that exposes black's king before it can escape to safety. In this video, I am going to walk you through every main idea, every critical sideline, every trap you need to know, and by the end of it, you will understand this at a level most of your opponents never will. This is going to be a really good one. Let us forge into it. This opening was introduced by the Italian master Giulio Polerio in 1590. The name comes from the Italian word fegatello, meaning a cheap cut of liver, something tossed away without care. Because the knight is sacrificed so boldly, it seems almost reckless. It is a daring knight sacrifice that tears open black's king position before castling is even possible. The fried liver attack is one of the most precise tests you can set black in the Italian game, and understanding it at a structural level, not just memorizing moves, is what separates players who wield it from players who fumble it. Let us walk through it move by move. Pawn to e4. A claim on central space, the foundation everything else is built on. Pawn to e5. Black mirrors the claim, and we have a symmetrical central tension that will need to be resolved. Knight to f3. The knight attacks the e5 pawn while developing toward the center, efficient and principled. Knight to c6. Black defends the pawn with a developing move, also perfectly principled. Bishop to c4. This is where white's intentions start to take shape. The bishop eyes the f7 square, the softest point in black's position. Knight to f6. Black develops with tempo, attacking the e4 pawn, but this move also places the knight on a square it will soon regret occupying. Knight to g5. White abandons the e4 pawn entirely and redirects both attacking pieces. The bishop and the knight now on g5, toward f7 simultaneously. Pawn to d5. Black's best practical response. Rather than defending passively, black strikes at the bishop and tries to complicate the position before white's threats mature. Pawn takes on d5. White accepts the central exchange, and now the d5 pawn becomes a lure. The question is what black does with it. Knight takes on d5. Black recaptures with the knight, centralizing it and seemingly winning back the material. But this knight is now on a square that white is about to exploit directly. Knight takes on f7. White executes the core idea of the entire opening. The knight leaps into f7, forking the queen and the rook, and forcing black's king into the open. Black's king has been flushed into the center and now faces a decision that defines the entire line: how to respond to the knight. Anything else just loses a piece. Queen to f6 runs into bishop takes d5. Queen to d7 runs into knight takes h8. Pause the video and decide what you would play here. This opening has been played in over 24,000 games at master level. When black takes on f7, the game enters its most complex territory. White has no extra material, so every move must generate threats faster than black can consolidate. Alright, here we go. Let me show you how it plays out. King takes on f7. Black accepts the knight and the exposed king, betting that the extra material will matter in the long run. Queen to f3. White puts the king on the clock immediately. You cannot give black a single quiet move to regroup. King to e6. The king steps forward because every retreat square is either checked or controlled, and this is the only move that keeps the extra piece. Knight to c3. White develops with tempo, eyeing d5 and e4, and building the web that will keep the king trapped in the center. Knight to b4. Black's knight jumps in to threaten the pawn and give the position some counterplay. This is the most resilient try. Castle's kingside. White gets the king to safety and activates the rook, refusing to be distracted by the c2 threat just yet. Pawn to c6. Black stabilizes the center and tries to give the king a future retreat square on d7, the most logical defensive plan. Pawn to d4. White strikes in the center to open lines toward the exposed king before black can finish organizing. Knight takes on c2. Black cashes in on the loose pawn, but now the knight is stranded on the queen's side while the king still needs help. Pawn takes on e5. White captures and rips open the e-file, which now points directly at black's wandering king. Knight takes on a1. Black grabs the rook. Yes, you read that right. Black is up enormous material, but the knight is now completely out of play on the corner. Rook to d1. White plants the rook on the open d-file. setting up a battery that will coordinate with the queen and bishop to hunt the king. Queen to h4. Black tries to generate counterplay on the king side, but this queen is too far from its own king to matter in time. Bishop takes on d5. White sacrifices the bishop to shatter the pawn cover around black's king and open a check that forces the position. Pawn takes on d5. Black has no choice but to recapture, but now the pawn itself becomes a target for the queen. Queen takes on d5. White delivers check while recapturing, and the king has nowhere safe to go. You need to know this move because it is the engine that keeps the pressure relentless. Keep this position burned into your memory. Even with a rook and 2 pawns down in material count, White's activity along the open files makes Black's coordination nearly impossible. In practice, White scores 61% from this position. White scores very well from here. Within the accepted gambit, Black has another try here. When Black plays queen to f6 instead of king to e6, it looks like a natural block, but it walks straight into a refutation. Let us see exactly how this opening develops. King takes on f7. Same starting point as the main line. Black takes the knight. Queen to f3. White's check is identical, and here Black tries to shield with the queen rather than advance the king. Queen to f6. This looks like it blocks the check and contests the f-file, but it fatally leaves d5 unprotected. Bishop takes on d5. White snaps the knight with check, and now the queens are forced to trade, leaving Black with an exposed king and no way to survive the endgame. This line loses on the spot because the queen trade that follows, bishop takes d5 strips away Black's last piece of coordination, and the exposed king cannot hold. Here's an alternative Black sometimes plays at this point. King to e8 is the retreat that looks safe, but simply delays the collapse. Unlike the main line where Black fights with the king, here Black just gives White a free tempo. Okay, let us take it from the very first move. King takes on f7. Black accepts, and the position is identical to the main line up to this point. Queen to f3. White checks, and now Black's choice of retreat defines everything. King to e8. Retreating to e8 looks timid, but Black is hoping to tuck the king back to d8 or connect the rooks. None of that happens. Bishop takes on d5. Without the king to create tension, White simply takes the knight for free, winning material while keeping all the positional pressure of the main line. You have to understand that the difference here is subtle but decisive. By retreating to e8 rather than advancing to e6, Black surrenders a full piece without even making White work for it. Now, a real game showing these ideas in action. This game shows what happens when Black tries to sidestep the main defensive lines, and Zhigalko punishes that decision with a king hunt that never lets up. Here we go. Watch closely. Pawn to e4. White immediately stakes a claim in the center and signals that this game will be played on his terms. Pawn to e5. Agdestein accepts the symmetric battle, heading straight into open game territory where the fried liver becomes possible. Knight to f3. Zhigalko develops with tempo, already eyeing the pawn. Knight to c6, the natural defender of e5, and the move that confirms we are heading into an Italian or two-knight structure. Bishop to c4. The bishop lands on c4, pointing directly at f7. From this moment, the fried liver is a real threat. Knight to f6. Black develops and counterattacks e4, but this is exactly the move Zhigalko was waiting for. Knight to g5. The fried liver is on, the knight leaps toward f7, and Black must decide how to handle the f7 threat. Pawn to d5. The principled counterattack, striking at the bishop and fighting for central space. Pawn takes on d5. White opens the d-file and keeps the tension rather than retreating the bishop. Knight takes on d5. Black recaptures in the center, but now f7 is hanging with no knight to defend it. Knight takes on f7. This is the fried liver sacrifice. White gives up the knight to drag the black king into the open. King takes on f7. Black must accept. Declining leaves White with a free pawn and a huge positional advantage. Queen to f3. Immediate check forces the king to keep moving. White starts building the pursuit from the very first move. King to e6. The king steps toward the center, which feels wrong instinctively, but there is no better square available. Knight to c3. Zhigalko brings the second knight into the attack, eyeing d5 and adding pressure without rushing. Knight to e7. This is the deviation. Agdestein tries to shield the king with the knight rather than playing the main line with knight to b4, and it turns out to be the losing approach. Castle's kingside. Zhigalko tucks his king away and connects the rooks before committing to a direct assault. Pawn to c6. Black tries to give the king an escape route toward the queenside, but this move also weakens the d6 square. Pawn to d4. White opens the center to expose the king and activate every piece simultaneously. King to d6. The king retreats, but walking to d6 places it directly in the line of the bishop and in front of the coming rooks. Bishop to g5. The bishop enters with tempo, pinning the knight and making it impossible for black to coordinate any defense. Bishop to e6. Agdestein tries to challenge one of the attacking pieces, but this only accelerates the rook's entry into the game. Rook to e1. The rook bears down on the bishop and the king lurking behind it. Now every white piece has a purpose. Pawn takes on d4. Black captures, hoping to relieve some central tension, but this move hands white a new tempo for the attack. Knight to e4. Check. The knight forks with tempo, and the king is forced to keep moving. King to c7. The king tries to escape toward the queenside where it hopes the pieces thin out, but white's queen is ready to give chase. Queen to g3. Check. Zhigalko shifts the queen to a diagonal that cuts across the board, hurting the king further. King to b6. The king keeps running, now deep into queenside territory with nowhere safe in sight. Queen to b3. Check again. The queen is right on the king's heels, and you can feel Zhigalko tightening the net. King to c7. Black retreats back to c7, already going in circles under constant check. Queen to g3. Zhigalko repeats deliberately. He's not trying to win by repetition. He's maneuvering for the decisive setup. King to b6. The king steps back out again, and now Zhigalko springs what he's been preparing. Knight to d6. The knight jumps to d6 with strong effect, threatening the queen and cutting off the king's escape routes. Queen to d7. Agdestein protects against the knight's threat, but the queen is now pinned to the defense of d7 and unable to help the king. Pawn to a4. Zhigalko advances the queenside pawn to create a space-gaining push and deny the black king any queenside shelter. Pawn to a5. Black locks the queenside pawns, trying to keep lines closed, but the king remains exposed regardless. Queen to e5. The queen centralizes with a multi-directional threat, eyeing both the king and the c5 square. Knight to g6. Black attacks the queen, trying to force it back, but Zhigalko ignores the threat entirely. Queen takes on d4. Check. White picks up the pawn with tempo, and the king is suddenly short of squares again. Pawn to c5. Black attacks the queen, and the pawn chain collapses further, but material is now flowing toward white with each exchange. Queen to d3. The queen steps back to safety while maintaining pressure on the king's path and keeping the initiative. Queen takes on d6. Black finally captures the knight that has tormented him for so many moves, but now the rook enters the game with force. Rook to d1. The rook swings to d1, eyeing the queen and the open file. White's pieces are all now aimed at the exposed king. Pawn to h6. Agdestein attacks the bishop, but at this point every tempo black spends on counterplay is a tempo white uses to tighten the mating net. Rook takes on e6. White sacrifices the exchange to rip away one of black's key defensive pieces and expose the king completely. Queen takes on e6. Black must recapture, but now the queenside king is all alone with no minor pieces left to shield it. Bishop takes on d5. The bishop captures the knight, and now black's army is a queen, 2 rooks, and a bishop, none of them able to protect the king. Queen to d6. Agdestein centralizes the queen, hoping to build some counterplay, but white has seen the finish from here. Queen to b3. Check. The king is pushed back to the edge of the board with no defensive resource remaining. King to a7. The king tries to slip away to a7, but that square is a dead end with the pawn hanging and the queen already on the b-file. Queen takes on b7. Zhigalko delivers checkmate on b7. The king has nowhere left to run, and the queen, supported by the bishop, administers the final blow. When black plays knight to e7 instead of the main defensive moves, the king never finds a safe home. Zhigalko demonstrated exactly how to sustain the pursuit across the entire board, and the mate on b7 on move 26 was the direct consequence of that single early deviation. And there you have it, freed liver attack in all its glory. Now, my favorite part of every video. I want you to go out there and actually play this. Try the main lines, spring the traps, and have some fun with it. If you score a great win using what I just showed you, drop it in the comments. I love reading those, every single one of them. Subscribe for more, hit the bell, and I will catch you in the next deep dive.